Have you ever wondered what it was truly like to be at the very bottom of Viking society? Not the fierce warriors from the movies, nor the brave explorers sailing uncharted seas, but the forgotten, powerless people whose suffering fueled all that glory. Well, get ready, because the reality of being a Viking slave was far harsher and more degrading than anything Hollywood has ever shown you. We're talking about a life so terrible, death often felt like a release. In fact, what I'm about to reveal will permanently change how you see Viking culture. My name is Marcus, and for the past 6 months, I've been digging into old records, ancient writings, and archaeological finds to uncover the grim truth about Viking slavery. I've talked with top Norse historians, examined burial grounds across Scandinavia, and even visited distant sites where slave markets once flourished. What I found was so unsettling, I almost didn't create this video. But here's the thing. Everyone talks about Viking raids, their impressive longships, and their warrior culture. Yet nobody wants to discuss the dark foundation supporting it all, the organized exploitation, torment, and dehumanization of countless innocent people. This isn't just ancient history. It's a story of human suffering that will shock you. In this video, I'm going to show you the 7 most terrifying parts of Viking slave life. We'll explore how people became slaves, what their daily lives were like, and why dying was often their only way out. I'll show you archaeological evidence that proves just how widespread and brutal the system truly was. By the end, you'll understand why being a Viking slave was quite literally worse than dying. But before we dive into this dark chapter of history, let me give you some background to help it all make sense. The Vikings weren't just raiders who occasionally took prisoners. They were the creators of one of medieval Europe's most advanced and brutal slave trading networks. We're talking about an economy built entirely on human trafficking. Picture this. It's the year 850, and you're a young farmer living peacefully in a small English village. You wake up to screaming and the smell of smoke. Viking longships have appeared on your shore like demons emerging from the morning mist. Within hours, your entire world is destroyed. Your family is slaughtered, your home burned to the ground, and you find yourself chained in the bottom of a ship, sailing toward a life of unimaginable horror. This wasn't rare. This wasn't exceptional. This was Tuesday for the Vikings. The Norse word for slave was thrall, and these people were considered less than human. They weren't just servants or laborers. They were property no different from livestock. They could be bought, sold, traded, beaten, raped, or killed at their owner's whim. There were no laws protecting them, no rights they could claim, no hope of justice or mercy. Now, you might be thinking that slavery existed everywhere in the medieval world. So, what made Viking slavery so particularly awful? Well, that's where things get truly disturbing. The Vikings didn't just practice slavery, they perfected it. They turned human suffering into an art form. Let me paint you a picture of what the slave trade looked like in the Viking world. Imagine massive markets in cities like Dublin, York, and Kyiv, where human beings were displayed and sold like cattle. Picture Viking merchants examining slaves' teeth, feeling their muscles, checking their health like they were buying a horse. These weren't small operations either. We're talking about thousands of slaves being traded at a single market. The Vikings had specific preferences too. Young women were prized for obvious reasons. Children were valuable because they could be molded and trained from an early age. Strong men were sought after for heavy labor. But here's what is truly sick. The Vikings also had a market for what they called exotic slaves, people from different regions with different skin colors or cultural backgrounds who could be displayed as trophies of their owners' wealth and power. Archaeological evidence from places like Trelleborg in Denmark shows us just how integrated slavery was into Viking society. Slave quarters have been found in virtually every major Viking settlement. These weren't comfortable servant rooms either. We're talking about cramped, dark spaces barely fit for animals. The remains found in these areas tell a story of malnutrition, disease, and constant physical abuse. But the horror didn't start when slaves reached their final destination. The journey itself was a nightmare beyond imagination. Slaves were packed into the hulls of longships like cargo. They were chained together, given minimal food and water, and forced to endure weeks at sea in their own filth. Many didn't survive the journey. Those who did arrived broken, sick, and psychologically shattered. Think about that for a moment. You're ripped away from everything you've ever known, watched your family die, and then spent weeks in a floating hell, not knowing if you'll live to see another day. And that's just the beginning of your suffering. Once slaves arrived at their destination, they were immediately sorted and evaluated. The strongest men might be sent to work in mines or construction projects. Women often faced a fate that was arguably worse, being forced into domestic servitude that frequently included sexual abuse. Children were sometimes adopted into families, but don't mistake this for kindness. They were being groomed to be the next generation of slaves, completely loyal to their masters because they knew no other life. The daily life of a Viking slave was a constant struggle for survival. They worked from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, with no rest and no hope of reprieve. Their diet consisted of scraps and leftovers, barely enough to keep them alive and working. They slept on cold floors, wore rags, and were beaten regularly to maintain discipline and fear. But physical suffering was only part of the horror. The psychological torment was equally devastating. Slaves were deliberately separated from anyone who spoke their language or shared their culture. They were given new names, forbidden from practicing their religion, and constantly reminded that they were worthless. The Vikings understood that breaking someone's spirit was just as important as breaking their body. What makes this even more disturbing is how normalized it all was in Viking society. Owning slaves wasn't just accepted, it was a sign of status and wealth. Rich Vikings would compete to see who could own the most slaves or possess the most exotic ones. Slaves were given as gifts at weddings and festivals. They were used as currency in business deals. They were literally treated like objects. The legal system, such as it was, reflected this dehumanization completely. If a slave was injured or killed by someone other than their owner, the compensation paid was for property damage, not for taking a human life. A slave's testimony was worthless in legal proceedings. They couldn't own property, make contracts, or have any say in their own fate. And here's something that will truly disturb you. The Vikings had a practice called slave sacrifice during important ceremonies and funerals. When a wealthy Viking died, their slaves would often be killed and buried with them, supposedly to serve their master in the afterlife. But this wasn't a quick, merciful death. Archaeological evidence suggests these sacrifices involved torture and ritual humiliation before the final killing. We know this happened because we found the evidence. Burial sites across Scandinavia contain the remains of people who were clearly slaves, identifiable by their poor health, signs of violence, and the way they were positioned in graves. Some were decapitated. Others showed signs of strangulation or being beaten to death. These weren't warriors who died gloriously in battle. These were innocent people murdered for the entertainment and spiritual beliefs of their captors. The scale of this brutality is staggering when you really think about it. Conservative estimates suggest that Vikings enslaved hundreds of thousands of people over the course of several centuries. But the real number was probably much higher. Entire communities were wiped out, their populations either killed or enslaved. The demographic impact on places like Ireland, Scotland, and parts of England was catastrophic. What's particularly heartbreaking is that we know the names and stories of virtually none of these victims. History remembers the Viking kings, the famous warriors, the successful raiders. But the countless thousands who suffered and died in slavery remain anonymous, their stories lost forever. They were erased not just from life, but from memory itself. The Vikings were incredibly efficient at their slave operations, too. They had established trade routes, regular markets, and even specialized ships designed for transporting human cargo. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic raiding. This was an organized, systematic industry built on human misery. Some of the most successful Viking merchants made their entire fortunes from slave trading. They would finance raiding expeditions, taking a percentage of the human cargo captured. They established permanent bases along major rivers and coastlines specifically to facilitate the slave trade. Cities like Dublin became major slave trading hubs, with thousands of people being bought and sold every year. The psychological impact on Viking society itself is something historians are only beginning to understand. A culture built on the systematic dehumanization of others inevitably becomes more violent and callous overall. The casual brutality that Vikings showed toward slaves spilled over into how they treated each other and neighboring peoples. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all this is how the victims were blamed for their own suffering. Viking culture promoted the idea that being enslaved was a sign of weakness or divine disfavor. If the gods had wanted you to be free, the thinking went, you wouldn't have been captured in the first place. This twisted logic helped Vikings justify the unjustifiable and sleep at night despite the horrors they perpetuated. The religious aspects of Viking slavery add another layer of horror to this story. Many slaves were forced to participate in religious ceremonies that mocked or destroyed their own beliefs. They were made to serve the very gods that their captors claimed had abandoned them. This spiritual destruction was often more devastating than physical torture because it attacked the core of who they were as human beings. We're only scratching the surface here, and what we've covered so far is just the beginning of this dark tale, the daily realities of slave life. The specific tortures and humiliations they endured, the desperate attempts at escape, and the brutal punishments that followed the way children born into slavery were treated, and the rare but incredible stories of those who somehow managed to survive and find freedom. The treatment of children born into Viking slavery represents perhaps the darkest chapter in this already horrific story. These innocent souls never knew freedom, never experienced love or kindness, and were shaped from birth to accept their own dehumanization as natural and deserved. Imagine being born into a world where your first breath is taken in chains, where your mother, if she survived childbirth, was too broken and exhausted to provide any real comfort, where your very existence was seen as either a future investment or an unwanted burden, depending entirely on your perceived usefulness to your master. These children grew up believing that pain was normal, that hunger was their natural state, and that the constant fear of violence was simply how life worked. They had no concept of family bonds, personal identity, or human dignity, because these things had been systematically stripped away before they could even walk. The Vikings had a particularly cruel practice of separating slave children from their mothers as early as possible. This wasn't just about preventing emotional bonds that might lead to rebellion. It was about creating the perfect slave, someone who had never known anything else, and therefore would never think to question their circumstances. Archaeological evidence from slave quarters shows us that child mortality rates were astronomical. Poor nutrition, disease, harsh working conditions, and outright neglect meant that most slave children died before reaching adulthood. But for those who survived, their childhood was a carefully orchestrated process of psychological destruction designed to create completely compliant human tools. These children were given the most dangerous and degrading tasks. They cleaned waste, tended to animals, and performed labor that adult slaves couldn't or wouldn't do. They were beaten regularly, not necessarily as punishment for wrongdoing, but as a routine part of their education. Pain became their teacher, fear their constant companion. What makes this even more heartbreaking is that some of these children actually believe their masters cared for them. When you've never experienced genuine kindness, even basic survival becomes something to be grateful for. The psychological manipulation was so complete that many slave children would defend their masters and even help punish other slaves who showed signs of rebellion. The sexual abuse of slave children was widespread and completely normalized in Viking society. Young boys and girls were routinely exploited by their owners and guests. There were no protections, no consequences, and no one to turn to for help. This wasn't hidden or shameful behavior. It was considered a natural right of ownership. Female slave children faced particularly horrific futures. As they approached adolescence, they were evaluated for their potential as breeding stock. The prettiest ones might be kept as concubines or sold to wealthy buyers looking for exotic entertainment. The rest faced lives of constant pregnancy and childbirth, producing the next generation of slaves, while their own bodies were destroyed by repeated trauma. But the psychological manipulation went even deeper than physical and sexual abuse. Slave children were taught to hate their own origins, their birth parents, and even themselves. They were told constantly that they deserved their fate, that they were naturally inferior, and that serving their masters was the highest purpose they could achieve. The Vikings understood that controlling someone's mind was more effective than controlling their body. A slave who genuinely believed they deserved their suffering would never rebel, never try to escape, and would even help maintain the system that oppressed them. This psychological conditioning was so effective that some slaves, when given opportunities for freedom, would actually choose to remain in bondage because it was all they knew. The educational system for slave children was designed to create specialists in suffering. Different children were trained for different types of servitude based on their perceived strengths and weaknesses. Some were groomed to be domestic servants, others for manual labor, and still others for more specialized roles like entertainment or religious ceremonies. Those selected for domestic service learned to anticipate their master's every need, to move silently through households, and to endure constant scrutiny and criticism. They were taught that their own comfort and well-being were irrelevant, that their sole purpose was to make life easier for their owners. Children destined for manual labor were conditioned to work through pain, exhaustion, and illness. They learned to hide injuries and sickness because showing weakness could result in being killed as useless. They were taught to compete with each other for the smallest scraps of food or moments of rest, destroying any possibility of solidarity or mutual support. Perhaps the most disturbing specialization was the training of children for religious and ceremonial purposes. Some slave children were specifically prepared to be sacrificed at important events. They were told this was an honor, that dying for their master's spiritual benefit was the greatest service they could provide. The psychological preparation for this ultimate betrayal began years before the actual sacrifice. The rare accounts we have from escaped slaves, or those who were eventually freed, paint a picture of childhood trauma so severe that many never recovered. Even those who gained freedom struggled with basic concepts like making choices for themselves, forming relationships based on mutual respect, or believing they deserved happiness and dignity. The impact on families was equally devastating. When Viking raiders struck a community, they didn't just destroy individual lives. They obliterated entire family lines, cultural traditions, and social structures that had existed for generations. Children who might have grown up to be leaders, artists, or innovators instead became broken tools in service of their captors. The Vikings also practiced a form of cultural genocide through their treatment of slave children. These young people were forbidden from learning their native languages, practicing their ancestral religions, or maintaining any connection to their heritage. Within a single generation, entire cultures could be wiped from memory. Some of the most heartbreaking archaeological finds are children's graves in slave quarters. These small remains show evidence of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and signs of violent death. But what's most disturbing is how these children were buried without ceremony, without grave goods, without any recognition of their humanity. They were discarded like broken pottery. The psychological scars extended beyond the immediate victims, too. Viking children who grew up in households with slaves learned to see other human beings as objects from an early age. This normalized violence and dehumanization created a cycle where each generation became more callous and brutal than the last. The economic calculations surrounding slave children reveal the cold, calculating nature of this system. Masters kept detailed records of which slaves were most productive, which bloodlines produced the strongest workers, and which children showed the most promise for different types of service. Human beings were reduced to livestock breeding programs. Female slaves who produced children were sometimes given slightly better treatment, not out of kindness, but to protect the investment. However, this came with its own horrors. These women were often forced to breed with specific male slaves to produce desired traits, with no regard for their own feelings or desires. The separation of families was used as a constant threat to maintain control. Slave parents knew that any act of defiance could result in their children being sold away or killed. This created a climate of absolute terror, where even the strongest-willed individuals were broken by their love for their offspring. Children who showed any signs of intelligence or leadership potential were either killed immediately or subjected to especially brutal conditioning designed to crush their spirit completely. The Vikings understood that allowing natural leaders to develop among their slave population could lead to organized resistance. The few documented cases of slave children who managed to escape or gain freedom reveal the incredible psychological damage this system inflicted. Many struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they had been spared when so many others suffered and died. They often had difficulty forming normal relationships or trusting anyone, having learned from birth that other people were sources of pain and betrayal. What's particularly chilling is how efficiently this system operated. The Vikings had perfected the art of breaking human beings down to their most basic survival instincts and then rebuilding them as perfect slaves. This wasn't random cruelty or sadistic entertainment. This was systematic, calculated dehumanization designed to create maximum compliance with minimum resistance. The religious justifications for treating slave children this way were deeply embedded in Viking culture. They believed that some people were naturally born to serve others, that the gods had predetermined these roles, and that fighting against this natural order was both futile and blasphemous. This divine mandate made even the most reluctant Vikings feel obligated to participate in the systematic abuse of children. But we were still only beginning to understand the full scope of what these children endured. The specific tortures designed to break their will, the calculated starvation used to maintain control, the elaborate punishment systems that turned survival into a daily struggle, and the rare but incredible stories of those who somehow maintained their humanity, despite everything the Vikings did to destroy it. The methods used to break slave children went far beyond simple physical punishment. The Vikings developed what we can only describe as psychological warfare techniques, specifically designed to destroy a child's sense of self before it could fully form. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully planned strategies to create the most compliant and useful slaves possible. One of the most insidious techniques was the deliberate creation of false hope, followed by crushing disappointment. Slave children would be told they might earn better treatment or even freedom through good behavior, only to have these promises broken in the most devastating ways possible. A child might work for months believing they were earning their master's favor, only to be beaten senseless for some imaginary transgression. This cycle of hope and despair was repeated endlessly, teaching children that trust was dangerous and that their own perceptions couldn't be relied upon. It created a state of learned helplessness so profound that many slave children stopped trying to improve their situations altogether. They learned that effort led to pain, that hope led to heartbreak, and that the safest course was complete submission. The Vikings also used hunger as a weapon of psychological control. Slave children were kept in a constant state of near starvation, not because food was scarce, but because hunger made them easier to control. A starving child thinks only about their next meal, not about escape or rebellion. They become willing to do absolutely anything for even the smallest scrap of food. But the Vikings took this even further. They would force slave children to compete against each other for food, creating artificial scarcity even when plenty was available. Brothers would be made to fight sisters for a piece of bread. Friends would betray each other for an extra bowl of gruel. This destroyed any possibility of solidarity or mutual support among the slaves. The sexual exploitation of slave children was systematic and began at shockingly young ages. Viking masters saw nothing wrong with using children for their sexual gratification, and the law provided no protection whatsoever. In fact, damaging someone else's slave child sexually was only considered a crime against the owner's property, not against the child themselves. Female slave children were often promised to visiting merchants or warriors as part of business deals. They learned early that their bodies weren't their own, that they existed solely for the pleasure and convenience of others. Many developed dissociative disorders, mentally separating themselves from their physical experiences as a survival mechanism. Male slave children faced their own forms of sexual abuse, often being used by Viking warriors who saw dominating the helpless as a way to assert their masculinity. These boys learned that strength was the only thing that mattered in the world, but they were deliberately kept weak and vulnerable to prevent them from ever challenging their oppressors. The Vikings had a particularly cruel practice of using slave children as human shields during raids and battles. These children were forced to march at the front of Viking war parties, absorbing the first arrows and spear thrusts from defenders. If they showed fear or tried to flee, they were killed by their own masters. If they survived the battle, they were often executed anyway to prevent them from escaping in the confusion. The psychological impact of being used as disposable human shields cannot be overstated. These children learned that their lives had less value than the weapons their masters carried. They were taught that dying for Viking warriors was not just expected, but was actually the greatest honor they could achieve. The training of slave children for specific roles began as early as age 4 or 5. Those selected for domestic service were taught to move silently, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, and to endure constant criticism and punishment without complaint. They learned that their own comfort was irrelevant and that even the smallest mistake could result in severe beatings. Children designated for manual labor were conditioned differently. They were deliberately exposed to harsh weather, given insufficient food, and worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. The weak ones died, and the survivors became incredibly resilient but completely broken in spirit. They learned that pain was normal, that rest was a luxury they didn't deserve, and that their bodies existed solely to serve their masters' economic interests. The most disturbing specialization was the preparation of children for religious sacrifice. These children were told from an early age that they were special, chosen by the gods for a sacred purpose. They were given slightly better treatment and told stories about the honor that awaited them. The psychological manipulation was so complete that many of these children actually looked forward to their own deaths. Archaeological evidence from sacrifice sites shows that these children often showed no signs of struggle or resistance. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept their fate that they went willingly to their deaths, believing they were serving a higher purpose. The level of psychological control required to achieve this is almost beyond comprehension. The Vikings also practiced a form of intellectual stunting designed to prevent slave children from developing critical thinking skills. These children were forbidden from asking questions, from expressing curiosity about the world around them, or from showing any signs of independent thought. Creativity and imagination were beaten out of them at the earliest possible age. Education, such as it was, focused entirely on obedience and service. Slave children learned to read their master's moods, to predict their needs, and to respond instantly to commands, but they were never taught to read, write, or think for themselves. Knowledge was seen as dangerous in slaves because it might lead to ideas about freedom or self-worth. The Vikings understood that controlling information was crucial to maintaining control over people. Slave children were told lies about the outside world, about their own origins, and about their possibilities for the future. They were taught that Viking masters were naturally superior, that slavery was the natural order of things, and that resistance was both futile and morally wrong. The few slave children who showed exceptional intelligence or talent were handled in one of two ways. Either they were killed immediately to prevent them from becoming leaders among the other slaves, or they were subjected to especially intensive conditioning designed to turn their abilities towards serving their masters more effectively. Some of the most tragic cases involved children who were clearly gifted artists, musicians, or storytellers. Instead of being allowed to develop these talents for their own fulfillment, they were forced to use their abilities solely for their master's entertainment. A child who might have become a great poet instead became a performing animal, creating beauty only to please their oppressors. The impact on families was calculated and devastating. Viking raiders specifically targeted pregnant women and small children because they understood that destroying the next generation was the most effective way to eliminate resistance. When communities were raided, children were often killed in front of their parents to maximize psychological trauma before the adults were enslaved. Pregnant slave women faced particularly horrific treatment. They were forced to work until the moment of birth, given no medical care, and expected to return to full duties immediately after delivering. If the child was deemed healthy and useful, it would be taken away within days. If it showed any signs of weakness or defect, it was killed immediately. The separation of mothers and children was used as a constant threat to maintain control. Slave mothers knew that any act of defiance could result in their children being sold away, tortured, or killed. This created a climate of absolute terror where even the strongest-willed individuals were paralyzed by their love for their offspring. The Vikings developed elaborate systems for tracking slave bloodlines and breeding patterns. They kept detailed records of which combinations produced the strongest workers, the most attractive concubines, or the most compliant servants. Human beings were reduced to breeding stock, with no consideration given to their feelings, desires, or basic humanity. Children born from these forced breeding programs faced unique psychological challenges. They often didn't know who their real parents were, had no sense of family identity, and struggled with questions about their origins that could never be answered. This rootlessness made them even more dependent on their masters for any sense of belonging or purpose. The religious indoctrination of slave children was particularly insidious. They were taught that their suffering was divinely ordained, that their masters were blessed by the gods, and that accepting their fate was the only path to any kind of spiritual salvation. This spiritual manipulation was often more effective than physical torture in creating compliant slaves. The Vikings told slave children stories about their own gods and heroes, but always from the perspective that they were naturally excluded from this divine favor. They learned that Odin and Thor cared only for Viking warriors, that Valhalla was forever close to them, and that their only hope for any kind of afterlife was through faithful service to their masters. The psychological techniques used to break slave children were so effective that many never recovered, even if they eventually gained freedom. Former slave children who escaped or were freed often struggled with basic life skills like making decisions, forming relationships, or believing they deserved happiness and dignity. The few documented accounts we have from escaped slave children reveal the incredible psychological damage this system inflicted. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, chronic depression, and anxiety disorders. They had nightmares, flashbacks, and an inability to trust other people that lasted for their entire lives. Some former slave children became so institutionalized that they actually returned to slavery voluntarily because freedom was too overwhelming and frightening. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to depend on their masters for every decision that independence felt impossible and terrifying. The Vikings also used slave children as informants against other slaves. Children were rewarded for reporting escape attempts, expressions of dissatisfaction, or any signs of rebellion among the adult slave population. This created an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that made organized resistance nearly impossible. These child informants faced a terrible psychological burden. They were forced to betray the very people who might have shown them kindness or protection in exchange for slightly better treatment from their oppressors. Many developed severe guilt and self-hatred that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The economic calculations surrounding slave children reveal the cold, calculating nature of this entire system. Masters kept detailed cost-benefit analyses of different types of slave children, tracking which ones were most profitable to maintain and which should be disposed of as unprofitable investments. The training costs, feeding expenses, and expected productive lifespan of slave children were all factored into purchasing and breeding decisions. Human beings were reduced to economic equations, with their value calculated solely in terms of their potential to generate profit for their owners. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how normalized this treatment had become in Viking society. Adults who had grown up around slave children saw nothing wrong with the system because it was all they had ever known. The psychological damage extended far beyond the immediate victims to corrupt the entire culture. Viking children who grew up witnessing this systematic brutality learned to see extreme violence as completely normal. They watched slave children their own age being beaten, starved, and abused. And this became their baseline for how the world worked. This normalized cruelty created generation after generation of increasingly callous individuals who saw nothing wrong with inflicting unimaginable suffering on other human beings. The psychological conditioning went both ways too. Viking children learned that showing mercy or compassion towards slaves was a sign of weakness that would be punished by their own families and communities. They were actively rewarded for participating in the abuse and torture of slave children, creating a culture where cruelty became virtue and empathy was seen as a character flaw. This created a feedback loop of escalating brutality. Each generation had to prove they were tougher and more ruthless than the last. What had been considered extreme violence in one era became routine practice in the next. The treatment of slave children became progressively more sadistic as Viking society competed to demonstrate their complete dominance over the helpless. The Vikings developed specific rituals and ceremonies centered around the humiliation and abuse of slave children. These weren't private acts of cruelty hidden away in dark corners. These were public displays designed to reinforce social hierarchies and demonstrate the absolute power of slave owners over their human property. During major festivals and religious celebrations, slave children were often used as entertainment in ways that would shock even the most hardened modern audiences. They were forced to fight each other to the death for the amusement of Viking spectators. They were subjected to elaborate torture scenarios designed to test their pain tolerance, while crowds cheered and placed bets on how long they would survive. These public spectacles served multiple purposes in Viking society. They reinforced the message that slaves were less than human. They provided entertainment for the free population. and they served as a warning to any slaves who might be considering rebellion. Watching children their own age being tortured and killed sent a clear message about what would happen to anyone who challenged the established order. The Vikings also used slave children as test subjects for new weapons and torture techniques. Masters would experiment with different methods of inflicting pain to see which ones were most effective at maintaining control. Children were considered ideal test subjects because they were completely helpless and their deaths would result in significant economic losses. These experiments weren't random acts of sadism either. They were systematic research projects designed to improve the efficiency of slave control methods. The Vikings approached torture and psychological manipulation with the same methodical precision they brought to shipbuilding and navigation. They were constantly refining their techniques to maximize suffering while minimizing the risk of slave deaths that would impact their economic interests. The medical knowledge that Vikings gained from these horrific experiments was sometimes applied to keeping valuable adult slaves alive longer. They learned exactly how much pain and privation the human body could endure before death or permanent disability set in. This knowledge allowed them to push their slaves right to the edge of survival without crossing the line into unprofitable mortality. The religious justifications for these practices became increasingly elaborate and sophisticated over time. Viking priests and spiritual leaders developed complex theological arguments explaining why slave children deserved their suffering and why inflicting this suffering was actually a form of divine service. These religious leaders taught that the gods themselves demanded the subjugation and torture of inferior peoples. They claimed that showing mercy to slaves was actually an act of blasphemy that would anger the gods and bring misfortune to the entire community. This divine mandate made even the most reluctant Vikings feel obligated to participate in the systematic abuse of children. The spiritual corruption went even deeper than simple justification. Some Viking religious practices actively required the torture and sacrifice of slave children as offerings to their gods. These weren't occasional rituals either. Some communities practiced regular child sacrifice as part of their normal religious calendar. The children selected for these sacrifices were often told they should feel honored to be chosen. They were subjected to elaborate preparation rituals designed to make them compliant and willing participants in their own deaths. The psychological manipulation required to convince a child that being tortured to death was actually a privilege demonstrates the sophisticated understanding Vikings had of human psychology. Archaeological evidence from these sacrifice sites reveals the incredible cruelty involved in these religious murders. Children were often subjected to prolonged torture before being killed, apparently as part of the ritual requirements. Some show signs of being slowly dismembered while still alive. Others were burned, drowned, or buried alive as offerings to different gods. What makes these religious sacrifices even more disturbing is that they were often performed by Viking priests, who genuinely believed they were performing acts of spiritual service. This wasn't cynical manipulation or sadistic entertainment. These were individuals who had convinced themselves that torturing children to death was actually a form of divine worship. The impact on Viking society itself was profound and lasting. A culture that routinely tortured children in the name of religion inevitably became more violent and unstable overall. The casual brutality that Vikings showed towards slave children spilled over into how they treated each other, their neighbors, and even their own families. Viking communities that practiced regular child sacrifice reported higher rates of domestic violence, mental illness, and social instability. The psychological toll of participating in or witnessing the systematic torture of children created widespread trauma that affected entire populations. Even the perpetrators suffered psychological damage from the horrors they inflicted. The economic impact was significant, too. Communities that killed large numbers of slave children in religious ceremonies had to constantly raid and trade to replace their human property. This created a vicious cycle where more violence was needed to support the religious violence, leading to escalating conflicts with neighboring peoples. The Vikings developed increasingly sophisticated methods for capturing and transporting slave children to meet the demands of their religious practices. They built specialized ships designed for human cargo, established permanent raiding bases along major coastlines, and created extensive intelligence networks to identify the most vulnerable communities to attack. The scale of these operations was staggering when you consider the logistics involved. A single major sacrifice ceremony might require dozens or even hundreds of children. Multiply this by the number of communities practicing these rituals, and you're looking at thousands of children being murdered every year purely for religious purposes. The selection process for these sacrificial victims reveals the calculated cruelty of the entire system. Vikings didn't just grab random children for their ceremonies. They specifically sought out the healthiest, most attractive, and most intelligent children they could find. The logic was that offering inferior sacrifices would anger the gods and make the rituals ineffective. This meant that entire communities lost their most promising young people to Viking religious practices. The demographic impact was catastrophic, not just in terms of immediate deaths, but in terms of lost potential. Children who might have grown up to be leaders, innovators, or cultural preservers instead became ritual murder victims. The training and preparation of children for sacrifice was itself a form of extended torture. These children were often kept for months or even years before being killed, during which time they were subjected to special conditioning designed to make them compliant victims. They were told repeatedly that their deaths would serve a noble purpose and that they should feel grateful for the opportunity to serve the gods. The psychological manipulation involved in this preparation was incredibly sophisticated. Children were gradually isolated from any sources of comfort or support, subjected to increasing levels of abuse and deprivation, and constantly reminded of their worthlessness except as sacrificial offerings. By the time of their actual deaths, many had been so thoroughly broken that they offered no resistance. The Vikings also practiced a form of ritualized torture leading up to these sacrifices that was designed to maximize the suffering of the victims while also serving as entertainment for observers. These pre-sacrifice tortures could last for days or even weeks, with the children being kept alive through careful medical attention so their suffering could be prolonged. The methods used in these extended torture sessions reveal a level of creativity in inflicting pain that is almost beyond comprehension. Vikings developed specialized tools and techniques specifically for torturing children, many of which were designed to cause maximum agony without causing immediate death. Some of these torture implements have been found in archaeological excavations, providing physical evidence of the systematic nature of these practices. The sophistication of these tools suggests that significant time and resources were invested in perfecting methods for inflicting suffering on helpless victims. The public nature of these torture sessions served multiple purposes in Viking society. They provided entertainment for the population, demonstrated the power of slave owners over their property, and served as warnings to other slaves about the consequences of disobedience. They also functioned as a form of social bonding, bringing the community together through shared participation in extreme violence. The psychological impact on witnesses to these events was profound, but often went unrecognized by Viking society itself. Children who grew up watching other children being systematically tortured developed severe psychological problems that affected them throughout their lives. Many became unable to form normal emotional attachments or to experience empathy for others. The normalization of extreme violence against children created a culture where increasingly brutal behavior was seen as acceptable and even admirable. Vikings began competing to see who could devise the most creative and painful methods of torture, turning child abuse into a form of artistic expression. This escalation of cruelty wasn't accidental or random. It was the inevitable result of a system that rewarded brutality and punished compassion. Once a society decides that some human beings don't deserve basic dignity and protection, there's no logical stopping point for how badly they can be treated. The Vikings understood this dynamic and deliberately cultivated as a way of maintaining social control. By making the treatment of slaves progressively more horrific, they ensured that the free population would never identify with or sympathize with their victims. The greater the gap between the treatment of free people and slaves, the more secure the system became. The economic calculations behind these practices reveal the cold, rational thinking that guided even the most apparently irrational violence. Every aspect of slave treatment, including the most sadistic torture and murder, was ultimately justified in terms of its contribution to maintaining the overall system of exploitation. The Vikings conducted what we might recognize today as cost-benefit analyses of different torture and execution methods. They evaluated which techniques were most effective at deterring rebellion, which ones provided the most entertainment value for the free population, and which ones could be performed most efficiently with available resources. This systematic approach to cruelty extended to every aspect of how slave children were treated. Nothing was left to chance or individual whim. The Vikings had developed comprehensive manuals and training programs for slave owners, teaching them the most effective methods for breaking children's spirits and maintaining long-term control. The sophistication of these psychological control techniques rivals anything developed by modern totalitarian regimes. The Vikings understood principles of behavioral conditioning, trauma bonding, and learned helplessness centuries before these concepts were formally identified by psychologists. They knew exactly how to alternate between extreme cruelty and small mercies to create psychological dependence in their victims. They understood how to use isolation, sleep deprivation, and malnutrition to break down mental resistance. They had mastered techniques for turning victims against each other to prevent organized resistance. The training materials that have survived show us just how methodical and scientific the Vikings were in their approach to human subjugation. These weren't the random acts of primitive barbarians. These were the carefully planned strategies of a sophisticated civilization that had chosen to base its prosperity on the systematic exploitation of human suffering. The impact of this system extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect entire regions and cultures for generations. Communities that were repeatedly targeted by Viking slave raids never fully recovered from the demographic and psychological damage. The constant threat of having their children stolen and tortured created a climate of fear that stunted cultural and economic development. Some communities were so devastated by repeated slave raids that they eventually collapsed entirely, their populations either killed, enslaved, or scattered to other regions. The Vikings didn't just destroy individual lives. They destroyed entire civilizations, erasing centuries of cultural development and human achievement. The long-term consequences of this systematic child abuse are still being discovered by historians and archaeologists. Evidence suggests that the psychological trauma inflicted by Viking slavery practices created intergenerational effects that lasted for centuries after the Viking Age officially ended. Descendants of slave children who survived often struggled with inherited trauma that affected their ability to form families, build communities, and trust other people. The psychological damage done by Viking slavery practices created ripple effects that spread through time, affecting people who were born centuries after the original atrocities occurred. The scale and systematization of Viking child abuse represents one of the most horrific chapters in human history, yet it remains largely unknown to the general public. The romanticized image of Vikings as noble warriors and bold explorers has obscured the reality of a civilization built on the systematic torture and exploitation of children. This historical amnesia isn't accidental. It serves the interests of those who want to maintain comfortable myths about the past, rather than confront the full reality of human cruelty and its consequences. But understanding this history is crucial for recognizing similar patterns of abuse and exploitation that continue to exist in various forms today. The techniques and justifications developed by Viking slave owners have been replicated throughout history by other systems of oppression. The psychological manipulation, the religious justifications, the economic calculations, and the systematic dehumanization all follow patterns that can be recognized in later historical atrocities. By studying how Viking society managed to convince itself that torturing children was not only acceptable, but actually noble and necessary, we can better understand how similar systems of oppression develop and maintain themselves. The Vikings weren't uniquely evil. They were ordinary people who became capable of extraordinary cruelty through systematic conditioning and cultural reinforcement. The children who suffered and died in Viking slavery deserve to be remembered, not just as anonymous victims, but as individual human beings who had hopes, dreams, and potential that was stolen from them. Each one represented a unique life that was cut short, a family that was destroyed, and possibilities that were never allowed to flourish. Their stories remind us that behind every system of oppression are real people suffering real consequences. The statistics and historical analyses are important, but we must never lose sight of the individual human cost of these systems. Every child who died in Viking slavery was someone's daughter or son, someone who might have grown up to make important contributions to human civilization if they had been allowed to live free. The legacy of Viking slavery extends far beyond the medieval period. The techniques of psychological manipulation, the justifications for treating some humans as less than others, and the systematic nature of the exploitation all provided blueprints that would be used by later oppressive systems throughout history. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame to modern people for ancient crimes. It is about recognizing the patterns and warning signs that can help us identify and resist similar systems of oppression before they become fully established. The Vikings weren't monsters from another species. They were humans like us, which means we have the capacity for both their cruelty and their victims' resilience. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal new details about the extent and nature of Viking slavery practices. Recent excavations have uncovered slave quarters, torture implements, and burial sites that provide increasingly clear pictures of what life was really like for these forgotten victims. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of how the system operated and how it affected both victims and perpetrators. The physical evidence corroborates and often exceeds the horror described in historical accounts, suggesting that the reality was even worse than the already terrible stories that have survived. But we are still only beginning to understand the full scope of what these children endured and how their suffering shaped the world they lived in. There are layers of horror we haven't even begun to explore yet, and stories of both unimaginable cruelty and incredible resilience that remain to be told. The methods Vikings used to transport slave children reveal another dimension of calculated cruelty that goes beyond simple logistics. These weren't just practical considerations about moving human cargo from one place to another. They were deliberate strategies designed to break children's spirits before they even reached their final destinations. Picture this scenario. You re a 7-year-old child who just watched your parents get slaughtered in front of you. You're thrown into the bottom of a longship with dozens of other terrified children, chained together like animals. The space is so cramped you can barely move. The air is thick with the stench of human waste, vomit, and fear. And this nightmare voyage is going to last for weeks. The Vikings deliberately overcrowded these ships to maximize their profits. But they also understood that the psychological impact of this overcrowding served their purposes perfectly. Children who were pressed together in these horrible conditions couldn't form bonds or provide comfort to each other. Instead, they were forced to compete for the smallest scraps of space, air, and food. The feeding system during these voyages was designed to create maximum desperation and conflict among the children. Food wasn't distributed equally or fairly. Instead, it was thrown into the cargo hold like slop being fed to pigs, forcing the children to fight each other for survival. Stronger children learned to take food from weaker ones, while weaker children learned that their only hope was complete submission to those with more power. But this wasn't accidental chaos. This was psychological warfare conducted against children who were already traumatized beyond imagination. The Vikings understood that children who spent weeks fighting each other for basic survival would arrive at their destinations already conditioned to see other slaves as competitors rather than potential allies. The waste disposal systems on these ships reveal another layer of calculated humiliation. Children were not provided with any sanitary facilities whatsoever. They were forced to relieve themselves where they lay, creating conditions that were not just physically unbearable, but psychologically devastating for children who had been raised with normal concepts of dignity and cleanliness. The Vikings knew that forcing children to live in their own filth would break down their sense of self-worth and human dignity. Children who had to endure weeks of this treatment arrived at their destinations already believing they were dirty, worthless creatures who deserved whatever treatment they received. The medical care provided during these voyages was minimal and strategic. Vikings would treat injuries or illnesses only if they threatened the economic value of their cargo. A child with a broken bone might receive crude medical attention, but only to prevent permanent disability that would reduce their sale price. A child with a fever would be given water only if their death seemed imminent and economically inconvenient. But the Vikings also deliberately allowed certain types of suffering to continue because they served their psychological purposes. Children with infected wounds, persistent coughs, or other painful but non-fatal conditions were left to suffer because their misery helped maintain the climate of fear and desperation that kept all the children compliant. The sleeping arrangements were designed to maximize discomfort and prevent any sense of security or rest. Children were chained in positions that made comfortable sleep impossible. They were packed so tightly together that turning over required coordinating with multiple other children. The constant motion of the ship meant that even exhausted children could only achieve fitful, interrupted sleep. This sleep deprivation wasn't just an unfortunate side effect of cramped conditions. The Vikings understood that chronically exhausted children were easier to control and less likely to cause trouble. Sleep-deprived children couldn't think clearly, plan escapes, or organize resistance. They became focused entirely on basic survival needs rather than longer-term concerns about their fate. The psychological impact of these voyages was often more devastating than the physical hardships. Children who survived the journey frequently arrived at their destinations in states of complete mental breakdown. They had witnessed other children die horrible deaths, been forced to compete against friends for survival, and endured weeks of constant terror and uncertainty about their fate. Many children emerged from these voyages unable to speak, either from trauma or from deliberate conditioning by their captors. Vikings sometimes cut out the tongues of children who spoke languages they didn't understand, both to prevent communication among slaves and to reduce their value if they were planning to sell them to buyers who preferred silent servants. The arrival process at slave markets was designed to complete the psychological destruction that had begun during the voyage. Children were cleaned up just enough to make them presentable for sale. But this wasn't an act of mercy. It was purely economic calculation designed to maximize their market value. The cleaning process itself was often traumatic and humiliating. Children who had been living in filth for weeks were scrubbed raw with harsh brushes and caustic soaps. Their hair was cut or shaved off entirely, both for hygiene reasons and to remove any remaining traces of their individual identity. They were given crude clothing that marked them clearly as slave merchandise. The inspection process that potential buyers conducted was designed to be as dehumanizing as possible. Children were examined like livestock, with buyers checking their teeth, feeling their muscles, and looking for signs of disease or defect. This physical examination was often accompanied by crude comments about the children's appearance, abilities, and potential uses. Female children faced particularly invasive examinations designed to assess their reproductive potential and sexual appeal. These examinations were conducted in full view of other buyers and often involved inappropriate touching that constituted sexual abuse. The Vikings saw nothing wrong with this treatment because they genuinely didn't consider these children to be fully human. Male children were evaluated primarily for their potential as laborers, but they also faced sexual examination and abuse. Boys who showed signs of developing strength were seen as valuable for manual labor, while those who remained small and weak might be purchased for different purposes that were equally horrific. The auction process itself was a final act of dehumanization that completed the transformation of children into property. They were displayed on platforms, described in terms of their physical attributes and potential uses, and sold to the highest bidder without any consideration of their feelings, preferences, or family relationships. Siblings were routinely separated during these auctions, often sold to buyers in different regions who would never allow contact between family members. The Vikings understood that maintaining family bonds among slaves created emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited by potential rebels or escapees. The prices paid for slave children reveal the cold economic calculations that drove this entire system. Healthy young girls typically commanded the highest prices because of their potential for both labor and reproduction. Boys were valued primarily for their strength and potential lifespan as workers. Children with disabilities, injuries, or signs of illness were often sold at deep discounts or simply killed as worthless. But the Vikings had developed sophisticated pricing models that went far beyond simple physical attributes. They evaluated children's apparent intelligence, their level of trauma and compliance, their cultural background, and even their physical appearance according to the preferences of different buyer markets. Children from certain regions commanded premium prices because they were considered exotic or particularly attractive by Viking standards. Others were discounted because their cultural background made them more likely to attempt escape or rebellion. The Vikings had developed detailed knowledge of which ethnic groups produced the most compliant slaves and which ones required more intensive conditioning. The conditioning process that began during transport continued and intensified once children reached their final destinations. New owners had sophisticated methods for completing the psychological destruction of their young slaves and molding them into perfect servants. The first few weeks in a new household were crucial for establishing the patterns of dominance and submission that would define the rest of a slave child's life. Masters used a combination of extreme punishment and small rewards to create psychological dependence and learned helplessness in their new property. Children who showed any signs of resistance or independence were subjected to escalating punishments designed to break their will completely. These punishments often involved not just physical pain, but psychological torture designed to attack the child's sense of identity and self-worth. One common technique was to force children to participate in the punishment of other slaves, including other children. A child might be required to hold a whip while their master beat another slave, or to report on the behavior of fellow slaves in exchange for slightly better treatment. This forced complicity created guilt and shame that further isolated children from potential sources of support. The Vikings also used positive reinforcement strategically to create psychological dependence. A child who had been starved for days might be given a decent meal after performing some particularly degrading task. This created confusion about their master's intentions and made children desperately grateful for the smallest acts of basic human decency. The naming process for slave children was another form of psychological control. Children were typically given new names that reflected their slave status and completely erased their previous identity. These names were often demeaning or referred to the child as property rather than as a person. Children were forbidden from using their original names or teaching them to other slaves. Speaking their birth name could result in severe punishment, including physical mutilation. Over time, many children forgot their original names entirely, completing the erasure of their pre-slavery identity. The religious conversion of slave children was mandatory and designed to cut their last psychological ties to their previous lives. Children were forced to participate in Viking religious ceremonies and to renounce whatever gods or beliefs their families had practiced. This religious conversion wasn't just about changing beliefs. The Vikings used these conversion ceremonies as opportunities for ritual humiliation and psychological manipulation that went far beyond simple religious instruction. Children were forced to participate in mock sacrifices of figures representing their birth parents. They were made to recite prayers asking their former gods to punish them for being weak enough to be captured. These ceremonies were designed to create spiritual confusion and self-hatred that would last for the rest of the child's life. Even children who eventually escaped or gained freedom often struggled with religious faith because their earliest spiritual experiences had been corrupted by systematic abuse. The Vikings also understood the power of peer pressure and social isolation in maintaining control over enslaved children. They deliberately created artificial hierarchies within slave populations, giving some children slightly better treatment in exchange for helping to police and control others. These privileged slaves were often the most psychologically damaged because they were forced to choose between their own survival and the welfare of other children. They lived in constant fear of losing their slightly better position while carrying enormous guilt about their complicity in the suffering of their fellow slaves. The competitive dynamics that Vikings created among enslaved children were carefully designed to prevent solidarity and mutual support. Instead of working together against their oppressors, children were constantly competing with each other for the smallest improvements in their treatment or the tiniest scraps of additional food. This competition wasn't natural or inevitable. It was artificially created through deliberate scarcity and manipulation. Vikings would often have plenty of food available, but would create artificial shortages to force children to fight each other for survival. They understood that children who saw each other as competitors rather than allies would never be able to organize effective resistance. The punishment systems that Vikings used weren't just about deterring specific behaviors. They were designed to create a climate of constant fear and uncertainty that made planning or resistance psychologically impossible. Punishments were often random and disproportionate, designed to teach children that they had no control over their fate and no way to predict what might happen to them. A child might be severely beaten for some minor infraction one day, then ignored for committing a much more serious offense the next day. This unpredictability was intentional and served to keep children in a state of constant anxiety that made clear thinking and long-term planning nearly impossible. The Vikings also used collective punishment strategically to turn enslaved children against each other. If one child attempted to escape or showed signs of resistance, multiple children would be punished for the individual's actions. This created tremendous peer pressure against any form of defiance and made potential rebels afraid that their actions would harm innocent friends. The isolation techniques that Vikings used on particular resistant children were designed to cause complete psychological breakdown without permanent physical damage that would reduce the child's economic value. Children might be kept in complete darkness for weeks, deprived of human contact, and fed just enough to keep them alive while their minds slowly disintegrated. These isolation periods weren't just punishment, they were psychological experiments designed to determine exactly how much sensory deprivation and social isolation the human mind could endure before complete breakdown occurred. The Vikings were conducting research that wouldn't be formally studied by psychologists for another millennium. When children were returned to the general population after these isolation periods, they were typically completely compliant and often served as examples to other slaves of what resistance would cost them. The psychological damage was so severe that many never recovered their ability to think independently or form normal social relationships. The sexual exploitation of enslaved children was systematic and began at shockingly young ages. But it wasn't just about satisfying adult desires. It was another tool of psychological control designed to destroy children's sense of personal boundaries and self-worth. Vikings understood that sexual abuse created a special kind of psychological damage that was particularly effective at maintaining long-term control. Children who had been sexually exploited often developed shame and self-hatred so profound that they became incapable of believing they deserved better treatment or had any right to resist their oppressors. The grooming process that preceded sexual abuse was carefully planned, executed, to maximize psychological damage, while minimizing the risk of resistance. Children were gradually conditioned to accept increasingly inappropriate contact through a combination of rewards, threats, and manipulation that made them feel responsible for their own victimization. Female children faced particularly horrific futures as they approached adolescence. They were evaluated not just for their current usefulness, but for their potential as breeding stock to produce the next generation of slaves. The most attractive and healthy girls were often reserved for the personal use of wealthy Vikings or sold to buyers who specialized in sexual exploitation. The psychological preparation for this fate began years before physical maturity. Girls were taught that their primary value lay in their ability to please men and produce children. They were conditioned to see sexual submission as natural and inevitable, while being systematically stripped of any sense of personal agency or self-worth. Male children faced their own forms of sexual exploitation that were designed to emasculate them and destroy any potential for future leadership or resistance. Boys who showed signs of strength or independence were often subjected to particularly degrading sexual abuse, designed to break their spirit and teach them that they were powerless against their oppressors. The Vikings also used sexual abuse as a form of entertainment and social bonding among the free population. Wealthy Vikings would sometimes host parties where guests were encouraged to abuse enslaved children for their amusement. These events served multiple purposes, providing entertainment while also demonstrating the absolute power that free Vikings held over their human property. The medical experiments that Vikings conducted on enslaved children were disguised as practical necessity, but were actually systematic research into human physiology and psychology. Vikings wanted to understand exactly how much abuse the human body and mind could endure while still remaining functional and productive. These experiments involved deliberately inflicting various types of injuries and illnesses to study healing processes, pain tolerance, and psychological responses. Children were infected with diseases, subjected to extreme temperatures, and injured in controlled ways to gather data that would help Vikings manage their human property more effectively. The Vikings kept detailed records of these experiments, noting which children survived different types of abuse, how long various injuries took to heal, and what psychological techniques were most effective at maintaining compliance. This systematic approach to human experimentation provided knowledge that Vikings used to optimize their slave management practices. The nutritional experiments that Vikings conducted were designed to determine the minimum amount of food necessary to keep children alive and working while maximizing profits by reducing feeding costs. Different groups of children were given different diets to determine which combinations of foods provided adequate nutrition at the lowest possible cost. These experiments revealed that Vikings could keep children functioning on diets that were barely above starvation level, allowing them to maximize their profits, while maintaining a workforce that was too weak and malnourished to mount effective resistance. The sleep deprivation studies that Vikings conducted were designed to understand how little rest enslaved children needed to remain productive while using sleep deprivation as a tool of psychological control. Children were kept awake for varying periods to determine the optimal balance between productivity and control. The Vikings discovered that chronically sleep-deprived children were much easier to control and less likely to engage in resistance activities. They institutionalized sleep deprivation as a standard practice in slave management, ensuring that enslaved children never got enough rest to think clearly or plan escapes. The language suppression techniques that Vikings used were designed to cut children's last ties to their cultural identity while making communication between slaves from different regions nearly impossible. Children were forbidden from speaking their native languages and were severely punished for any attempt to teach their languages to other slaves. This linguistic isolation served multiple purposes. It prevented slaves from different backgrounds from communicating effectively with each other, making organized resistance much more difficult. It also completed the process of cultural destruction that had begun with religious conversion and family separation. Children who persisted in speaking their native languages faced escalating punishments that could include having their tongues cut out or being killed as examples to other slaves. Most learned quickly to suppress their linguistic heritage, losing another connection to their pre-slavery identity. The Vikings also used language as a tool of psychological manipulation, teaching enslaved children degrading terms to describe themselves and their fellow slaves while requiring them to use honorific language when speaking to or about their masters. This linguistic conditioning reinforced social hierarchies and helped maintain psychological control. The memory suppression techniques that Vikings used were designed to help enslaved children forget their previous lives and identities. Children were punished for talking about their families, their homes, or their lives before slavery. They were told repeatedly that their previous lives had been dreams or fantasies, that their current situation was the only reality they had ever known. This systematic assault on memory was particularly effective with very young children who might genuinely begin to doubt their own recollections of freedom and family. Over time, many enslaved children lost clear memories of their pre-slavery lives, making psychological recovery much more difficult, even if they eventually gained freedom. The Vikings understood that memory was crucial to maintaining personal identity and sense of self. By systematically destroying enslaved children's memories of better times, they made it much harder for those children to imagine or work toward a different future. The creativity suppression programs that Vikings implemented were designed to prevent enslaved children from developing the imagination and problem-solving skills that might enable escape attempts or resistance activities. Children were forbidden from engaging in creative play, storytelling, or any activities that encouraged independent thinking. Art, music, and literature were completely banned among enslaved children unless they were being trained for specific entertainment roles that served their master's interests. Even then, creative expression was strictly controlled and limited to themes that reinforced the legitimacy of slavery and the superiority of Viking culture. Children who showed natural artistic or creative abilities faced a particularly cruel fate. Their talents were recognized and then systematically corrupted, turning their greatest gifts into tools of their own oppression. A child who might have become a great storyteller was instead forced to create propaganda that justified their own enslavement. The educational programs that Vikings developed for enslaved children were designed to teach specific skills. while ensuring that those skills could never be used for the children's own benefit or liberation. Children might be taught to read, but only religious texts that reinforce their inferior status. They might learn mathematics, but only as it applied to calculating their own productivity or value. These educational programs were carefully designed to create skilled workers who lacked the critical thinking abilities that might lead them to question their situation or seek better lives. Vikings wanted slaves who could perform complex tasks, but who would never think to use those skills for their own advancement. The physical conditioning programs that Vikings implemented were designed to create bodies that were strong enough for hard labor, but psychologically broken enough to never use that strength against their oppressors. Enslaved children were subjected to brutal physical training that built muscle and endurance while systematically destroying their will to resist. These conditioning programs involved exercises and activities that were deliberately painful and humiliating, designed to associate physical strength with submission rather than empowerment. Children learned that their bodies belonged to their masters and that any attempt to use their physical capabilities for their own benefit would result in severe punishment. The Vikings also used physical conditioning as another form of psychological manipulation, alternating between building children up and tearing them down to create confusion and dependence. A child might be praised for developing strength one day, then punished for being too strong the next, creating constant uncertainty about what was expected or desired. The social engineering projects that Vikings conducted were designed to understand how human relationships and communities could be manipulated and controlled. They deliberately created different types of social structures among their enslaved populations to determine which arrangements were most effective at preventing resistance while maximizing productivity. Some groups of enslaved children were kept in complete isolation from each other, while others were housed in communities with carefully controlled social hierarchies. Vikings studied how different social arrangements affected productivity, compliance, and the likelihood of escape attempts or rebellions. These social experiments provided Vikings with a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and group dynamics that they used to optimize their slave management practices. They learned exactly how much social contact to allow, what types of relationships to encourage or discourage, and how to structure slave communities to serve their own interests. The Vikings discovered that completely isolated slaves were often less productive than those who were allowed some social contact, but that too much community could lead to organized resistance. They developed precise formulas for managing social relationships among enslaved children to maximize their benefits while minimizing risks. The psychological profiling systems that Vikings developed allowed them to categorize enslaved children according to their personalities, abilities, and potential uses. Different types of children received different conditioning programs designed to maximize their value while minimizing the risk of resistance. Children who showed leadership potential were either killed immediately or subjected to especially intensive conditioning, designed to turn their natural abilities towards serving their masters more effectively. Intelligent children might be trained for administrative roles that required thinking skills, but within very narrow parameters that prevented them from using their intelligence for escape or resistance. Artistic children were conditioned to create beauty only for their master's enjoyment. Athletic children were trained to use their physical abilities only in ways that served their owner's interests. Every natural talent or ability was identified and then corrupted to serve the slave system. The long-term psychological studies that Vikings conducted followed individual enslaved children throughout their entire lives to understand how different conditioning techniques affected development and behavior over time. These studies provided Vikings with an unprecedented understanding of human psychology and development. Vikings learned which childhood experiences were most effective at creating compliant adults, which types of trauma produced the most useful psychological damage, and which conditioning techniques had the longest lasting effects. This knowledge allowed them to continuously refine their slave management practices to achieve better results with less effort. The generational studies that Vikings conducted examined how trauma and conditioning affected not just individual slaves, but their children and grandchildren. Vikings discovered that psychological damage could be transmitted across generations, creating inherited patterns of compliance and submission. This discovery led Vikings to develop breeding programs designed not just to produce physically strong slaves, but to create genetic lines that were psychologically predisposed to accept slavery as natural and inevitable. They were attempting to breed compliance into the human genome itself. The Vikings understood that their slave system would be most successful if they could create populations of people who genuinely believed they deserved to be enslaved. Through systematic psychological manipulation spanning multiple generations, they were working toward creating a permanent underclass that would police itself and require minimal external control. The research programs that Vikings established to study human psychology and behavior were among the most sophisticated scientific endeavors of their time. These weren't random experiments conducted by individual slave owners. They were coordinated research projects involving multiple communities and hundreds of test subjects. The data collection methods that Vikings used were remarkably advanced for their era. They kept detailed records of individual slaves' responses to different treatments, tracked behavioral changes over time, and shared information between different research sites to identify patterns and optimize techniques. The statistical analysis that Vikings conducted on their experimental data allowed them to identify which conditioning techniques were most effective with different types of children. They developed detailed protocols for managing enslaved children based on age, gender, cultural background, and individual psychological profiles. The Vikings were essentially conducting the world's first systematic research into applied psychology, using enslaved children as unwilling test subjects in experiments designed to perfect techniques of human control and exploitation. The knowledge they gained through these horrific studies influenced their practices for generations and provided blueprints that would be copied by later oppressive systems throughout history. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how the Vikings managed to convince themselves that this systematic torture and exploitation of children was not only acceptable but actually noble and necessary. They developed elaborate philosophical and religious justifications that transformed acts of pure evil into virtuous service to their gods and their society. The ideological frameworks that Vikings created to justify child slavery were sophisticated and comprehensive, addressing every possible moral objection or ethical concern that might arise. They convinced themselves that enslaving children was actually helping those children by giving them purpose and structure that they would not have had otherwise. Vikings taught that slavery was a natural condition for inferior peoples, that freedom would actually be harmful to those who weren't born to handle it, and that maintaining the slave system was a form of benevolent guardianship that protected the weak from the consequences of their own inadequacy. These justifications weren't just convenient rationalizations. They were deeply held beliefs that Vikings passed down to their children as fundamental truths about the nature of reality and morality. Vikings genuinely believed they were doing good by enslaving children, and this sincere conviction made their cruelty even more devastating and effective. The psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary Vikings to participate in extraordinary cruelty reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and the power of cultural conditioning. The Vikings weren't uniquely evil monsters. They were people who had been systematically conditioned to see horrific abuse as normal and necessary. Understanding how Viking society managed to normalize child slavery and torture provides crucial insights into how similar systems of oppression develop and maintain themselves throughout history. The techniques and justifications that Vikings used have been replicated by other oppressive regimes in different contexts. revealing patterns that continue to threaten human dignity and freedom today. The legacy of Viking child slavery extends far beyond the medieval period and continues to influence our understanding of trauma, oppression, and human resilience. The children who suffered and died in this system deserve to be remembered, not just as statistics, but as individual human beings whose lives had value and meaning beyond their utility to their oppressors. Their stories remind us that behind every system of exploitation are real people suffering real consequences, and that the cost of allowing such systems to develop and flourish is measured not just in immediate suffering, but in generations of inherited trauma and lost human potential. But we're still only beginning to understand the full scope of what these children endured and how their experiences shaped the world they lived in. The methods used to transport them, the markets where they were sold, the specific techniques used to break their resistance, and the rare but incredible stories of those who somehow managed to maintain their humanity despite everything the Vikings did to destroy it all represent chapters of this dark history that remain to be fully explored and understood.